Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. Last week we kicked off Azorius Month with another Hot Brew, this time care of Tameshi pilot DJYavimaya. Big thanks to him for coming on and taking the time to share his take on the deck with us. And we're continuing as we build off some of the lessons from cEDH that DJ introduced in our last episode. cEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames, but there are lessons to be learned from how players are using some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. But before we get started, thank you! I'm still getting adjusted to the whole CCO media group thing, but the CCO Nation has been great in welcoming me. There have been some great discussions about getting started in cEDH, or just tuning up some high-powered decks as far as they can go in on the Patreon Discord. And the stuff I'm too excited to keep to myself while I'm working on it sometimes leaks out of my brain onto the Discord. So if you want to get on that discussion, links to the CCO Patreon are in the description. And if you feel like these episodes have earned it, a like or a subscribe on YouTube or your podcast app of choice go a long way as we get things going over here on CCO Media Group. Now, without further ado, I want to start talking about Azorius. Compared to dissecting a 3-color wedge-like teamer, talking about a single 2-color pair should be way easier, right? But this is a lesson from cEDH. So if we're thinking like cEDH brewers, we need to look at some of the challenges that low-color decks face in cEDH. And to do that, let's talk about the no bad cards theory of deck design. Essentially, no bad cards is a longer way to say good stuff. When you have access to every card in Magic's history, minus a few on the ban list, and you have a limited number of slots to put cards into your deck, you want to pick the best card that does the specific job you want from that particular slot in your deck. Like, if you're trying to choose a card for your last ramp slot in your deck, you're going to pick Sol Ring over Riven Turnbull every time, right? I mean, 7 mana for a dork who taps for a single black mana? God, imagine opening that in your Legends pack. No Bad Cards posits that a deck is made better by making sure that every card you draw is a good, useful addition to your hand no matter what's going on at the table. Which is why so many of the top cEDH decks have so many cards in common. You need to have a really good reason if you're playing a deck with red in it that doesn't include Dockside Extortionist. And if you're not playing a deck that includes red in its color identity, then you're missing out on the opportunity to play one of the most powerful rituals the game has ever seen. And that's the low color challenge. Low color decks have access to fewer colors, so they have already sacrificed access to some very efficient and very powerful cards. Low-color decks need to find alternatives that are available in their colors. Now, you can go too far with the no bad cards philosophy and arrive at soup decks, to steal a phrase from Callahan from the Mind Sculptors. Decks full of cards that are individually very powerful, but with none of them synergizing in a meaningful way or pushing your deck in a powerful direction. Which is one of the ways that a low-color deck can make up for not having access to powerhouses like Dockside Extortionist. For instance, compare Basalt Monolith to Dockside. It doesn't hold a candle to Dockside Extortionist, right? Well, except for when your commander is Keenan Bonder Prodigy, and you can tap Basalt Monolith for 4 instead of 3 while still untapping it for 3, and there you go, you've netted yourself unbounded colorless mana. This synergy is one way that low-color decks can succeed. So as we work to cover low-colored identities throughout our episodes this year, keep this phenomenon in mind. Low-color identities are defined as much by what their component colors can do as they are by what they lack from the colors they're missing. Now, I love me a good low-color deck, and I think Chicago will be the first event that I'm bringing more 3-color decks to than 2 or 1-color decks. So maybe I should get something fresh together for the event. If you have the urge to brew up something fresh for Chicago or any other event this year, you can check out our sponsor, FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. Murders at Karloff Manor is out, and there are a few singles that are calling my name in this set. Like that new cycle of ETB surveil lands with basic land types on them, fetchability is a huge plus. Just like saving 5% on my order with promo code on your screen or down in the description will be a huge plus for me. That's FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. Azorius is composed of white and blue. So this is the control color, right? We're done. Can I go now? Azorius is actually a lot more complex than that. Blue's stack-based interaction supports white's permanent-based stacks effects to not just stop players from trying to win, but also to protect important stacks effects or value pieces that the Azorius player has already developed. But in addition to Blue's stack-based counter magic, White also offers an absolute control of the stack in the form of silence effects, cards which prevent opponents from casting spells, or activating abilities, or casting a certain class of spell for the rest of the turn, or possibly until the end of the turn cycle. That makes a 1-mana spell like Silence a must-answer threat, because the spell or spells that follow it usually mean that the game is over, particularly in cEDH. This allows a deck in Azorius to demand additional casting of counter magic to have any chance of being able to stop them. White and Blue also offer some of the best sweepers in the format, most of which don't see a lot of play in cEDH, but outside of cEDH, White has the market cornered on cheap, effective 4-mana value board wipes, naming the whole category of Wraths with Wrath of God all the way back in Alpha, as well as introducing a number of slightly more complex Wraths with upsides, like Sunfall, which exiles all creatures and create an artifact that will transform into a big when you're ready for it, as well as even some modal sweepers like Farewell and Austere Command, which you can usually break parity on pretty easily. Blue offers one of the few sweepers that does get into cEDH regularly in the form of Cyclonic Rift as one of the best one-sided sweepers in the format, which can also be used as a 1-for-1 boomerang in a pinch at casual tables. As for single target removal, White and Blue have you covered against just about everything. White has answers to most permanent types outside of Planeswalkers, and have some of the most efficient creature removal spells ever printed in Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile. And Blue can usually bounce spells to temporarily remove most things, with Chain of Vapor being an all-star in cEDH. Blue is also temporarily the color which got removal with compensation with cards like Resculpt and Pognify, but that's now pretty firmly a White thing in the form of cards like Generous Gift and Stroke of Midnight. Resculpt has seen a little bit of play in cEDH in low-color decks for its versatility, but the expensive mana costs on the 2 and 3 mana value removal spells in cEDH really has limited their play. So between excellent single-target removal and excellent sweepers, backed up by great stacks effects and control of the stack, yeah, Azorius is the color combination that can answer just about anything on the board or in the air. They can answer threats preemptively with stacks effects that turn a would-be threat into a dead draw. They can counter a threat while it's still on the stack, or remove a troublesome permanent that's already turned into a threat. And if we look at the top multicolored Azorius cards on EDHREC.com, again, excluding Signets, Talismans, just for simplicity, we see that 3 have cracked the list of the top 100. Dovin's Veto is the first, a negate that can't be countered for White and Blue. Next up is Supreme Verdict, a board wipe that can't be countered. And finally, Time Wipe, another board wipe that lets you bounce and save one of your own creatures before the destruction comes. Just like on Ravnica, where the Azorius Senate makes the law, Azorius has the power to set the rules of a game of Commander and dictate to the other decks what kind of pace they can take and what strategies can function. We've identified so far that Azorius is the control color combination. If that's the case, then what is control in multiplayer? As we saw last week with DJ's take on Tameshi, playing control against 3 opponents is hard, because Blue's solution to the problem of stopping an opponent from doing a thing is to usually 1-for-1 them with counter magic to control the stack. It can get expensive. We've talked about control before in the old channel with concepts like crowd control, but today I want to go a little bit deeper into what control means in multiplayer Magic. Control faces a number of challenges in Commander, in that trying to answer 3 opponents and outdraw all 3 of them at once is virtually impossible. But it does have the advantage that in many cases, especially in cEDH, most decks just don't have a high density of game-ending threats. Which brings us to the first tenet of control in Commander. First, don't lose. Use your answers to stop game-winning threats. Stop the Turbo deck from being able to land a turn 2 Naws. Or stop the Kranko deck from sticking its commander, or maybe just get rid of the impact tremors before it activates. Blue doesn't lose by controlling the stack with counter magic, or bouncing a key piece that an opponent may have been depending on to score their wins. 1-for-1 exchanges which frequently leave both the control player and the would-be winner down on resources compared to their 2 opponents. White's contribution to this game plan is in step 2. Keep your opponents predictable and manageable. I'm paraphrasing some of this from an article that Spleenface wrote for Commander's Herald, link in the description. White's onboard stacks effects change the rules of the game, limiting the options available to your opponents to execute on their game plans. For example, if you control a Rest in Peace, you know your opponents can't easily go for a win with a card like Underworld Breach. And loops that rely on graveyard shenanigans like Animate Dead, these combos are out as well. There are a number of other ways to do this. In last week's interview, DJ described how Tameshi uses onboard quote-unquote rattlesnake cards like Seal of Cleansing to dissuade opponents from trying to jam a win into a known piece of onboard interaction. Similar to how our video from last year on crowd control talked about using cards like Umezawa's Jitte as a control element. But Azorius traditionally leans on white to play a static stacks effect that corners our opponents and limits their options to advance their game plan. If you can turn 2 out of 3 of the cards that your collective opponents draw into dead cards with your stacks effects, well, you're achieving parity on card draw, something that is almost impossible to do otherwise. And it still feels weird to say after years of failed design from Wizards of the Coast to help White and Commander, but there are really good card advantages in Azorius now. And I don't just mean Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora. White now has Esper Sentinel and Archivist Fogma. It's not too hard to have an opening hand in Azorius that promises to have a card advantage engine online and churning out value as early as turn 2 in cEDH. Developing a card advantage engine is a critical piece to playing control effectively, so you can have the answer you need when you need it. Without an adequate engine piece, it can be really hard to keep 3 opponents manageable, which brings us to step 3 of playing control: win comfortably. Usually an effective control deck has rendered its opponents bereft of resources and relatively helpless to stop their win. Back in Magic's early days, this was blue-white control, systematically killing off opposing creatures before slamming a Serra Angel followed by Armageddon. Whereas in modern cEDH, it's more like waiting for everyone else to have spent their resources fighting a losing battle against your control elements, then jamming your Breach or Thoracle Consult out when your opponents are virtually hellbent. So with an idea of how control functions in multiplayer, let's now look at Azorius decks across Commander and how they approach this problem. Looking at the data from EDHREC.com, our top 10 Azorius Commanders are: number 10, Ranar the Ever-Watchful, exile.deck, playing with Foretell and Blink shenanigans. Whether you call it Blink or Flicker or ETB.deck, effects that let you reuse ETB effects multiple times for value can be a great way to drown your opponents in advantage. ETB effects are among the most time-tested ways to generate value in Commander. If a creature card generates at least a card's worth of advantage on ETB, then you've negated at least part of the setback of being 1-for-1 by an opponent when they remove it. And if you can then trigger it multiple times, that's potentially a ton of value out of a single card spent. Outside of the top 10, but still popular, is Yorion, who can't legally be a companion in our format, but still makes for a pretty darn good commander. At number 9, we have Urza, Lord Protector. This is Meld Urza, who discounts artifacts, instants, and sorceries. Urza does a good job of pointing out most of the card types that Azorius cares about, discounting our best source of ramp and a decent source of stacks effects, while also discounting our interaction, making more of our draws into efficient answers to our opponent's plans, which again is step 2. Keep our opponents manageable and predictable. At number 8, we have Quain, Itinerant Meddler. Group Hug, or at least Group Hug adjacent, Quain plays many of the Group Hug cards, which can give opponents cards and other encouragement to send their attacks elsewhere. Again, serving to keep our opponents manageable and predictable by directing their game actions away from us. This doesn't translate as well into cEDH, as usually the impactful actions that they're taking are going to be incredibly detrimental to the entire table, so it's not very likely we'll see Quain making any headlines in cEDH soon, but still popular at casual tables. At number 7, we have Elminster, a planeswalker who rewards you for scrying by discounting instants and sorceries. Elminster again discounts many of the cards that we'd be relying on to control the board, and as a planeswalker survives most of the wraths we'd use to keep the board clear of threats. At number 6, we have Zethi, Arcane Blade Master. This is the Universes Within version of Chun-Li, who uses multi-kicker to create a storm of instants and sorceries whenever she attacks. Zethi is a unique aggro commander in Azorius, and if you look at her average list on EDHREC.com, you'll see that some combat tricks and some storm elements are built into the deck. She turns every combat step into another opportunity for the deck to get further and further ahead of her opponents. At number 5, we have Hilda of the Icy Crown, tap down .deck, rewarding you with snowmen or scries or anthems when you tap down an untapped opposing creature. Hilda leans into the tap-down effects like claustrophobia that are time-tested staples in almost every limited format. And within the past year or so, WotC has begun to use the technology of stun counter to generate tap-down effects that can last for multiple turns without creating memory issues. So expect to see lots of tap-down effects at all rarities in blue in the coming years, which could make Hilda more and more effective. At number 4, we have Grand Arbiter Augustin IV. Discounts for me and taxes for these, one of the OG Stax commanders. Grand Arbiter usually leans into the taxing side of Stax effects with propagandas and thalias to tax your opponent's spells and game actions, which often serves as an illustration to newer players for just how much a difference of a single mana and the cost of a spell makes that spell feel. Again, keeping opponents manageable and predictable by limiting the game actions they can take. At number 3, we have Millicent, Restless Revenant. Millicent deserves mention for being at the head of a Spirits deck, one of the few creature types in Azorius which is reasonably well developed for a commander deck. Spirits as a creature type include answers like Skyclave Apparition and even counterspells like Spellqueller, cornering our opponents and again keeping them manageable. At number 2, we have Brago, King Eternal, the original ETB deck. Basically everything I mentioned before about Ragnar, but arguably a lot better at most tables, as Brago can trigger a theoretically unlimited number of ETBs each combat step, with a very low investment of slots into having those blink and flicker effects since it comes out of the command zone. At number 1, we have Shorakai, Genesis Engine. So this deserves a closer look because if you're looking just at the data on EDHREC.com, there's a lot of the precon effect in the list, but when we put on the expensive filter, the deck shows us what cEDH players are trying to do with it. Transmute Artifact as the number 2 sorcery in the deck should immediately have us thinking the One Ring. Humility as the number 2 enchantment says, well, everything you need to know about its stacks plan. But Counterbalance at number 5 tells us that, sure enough, Sensei's Divining Top is also number 5 in utility artifacts for the combo with the Reality Chip and other future sight effects. Outside of the top 10, there's also a few other recurring themes that we can see. Kangi Skywarden, Errant and Giada, and Inyaz the Gale Force at numbers 21, 22, and 24 all care about flying. Bruna, Light of Alabaster, cares about auras, while Ifara can play the blink strategy, but also leans really heavily into flash creatures. So looking at all of this together, what we see is that white and blue have a lot of strengths together, but they do have some weaknesses, and if we are thinking like cEDH brewers, we need to look at what this color combination lacks. First, white and blue lack access to unconditional black tutors or green creature tutors. Don't get me wrong, they're pretty good at finding artifacts together, particularly equipment. White has Steel Shaper's Gift and Enlightened Tutor and other similar effects, while blue offers Transmute Artifact and Whir of Invention, rare tutors that get things directly onto the board. The tutor chains that we talked about with DJ are enabled by blue's spells, which can tutor up specific instants and sorceries, Spellseeker and Mystic Tutor, just to name a few. White has a few tutors that can grab enchantments in addition to Enlightened Tutor, though Idyllic Tutor and Moonblessed Cleric don't see a ton of play in cEDH. They're very good at more casual tables. Non-artifact creatures are tough for white and blue to consistently access, but white is starting to see more and more effects which can tutor up legendary permanents, like Search for Glory. It's a design space that Wizards continues to explore. White and blue also lack the explosive ramp that Jund colors have access to. No red or black rituals, no green dorks or land ramp spells. Azorius has to rely on boring old mana rocks and ramp-like peasants. Some cEDH brewers are leaning into some of the catch-up land mechanics inspired by land tax, using cards like Tithe as a 1-mana draw 2, which can get non-basic planes like Tundra and Hallowed Fountain. They're not considered a standard package in cEDH at this point, but there's a lot of potential for these effects outside of cEDH too. In fact, the technology of land tax plus scroll rack is one of the old-school commander card advantage engines that white decks routinely used to sculpt a winning hand. And of particular importance in cEDH, Azorius tends to lack ways to close out the game cleanly. Sure, a good Azorius deck can usually dictate the pace of the game well enough, but actually ending the game is tough. dedicated combos in Azorius that can end the game are few and far between. As we saw in the Tameshi episode with DJ, Tameshi is a really unique and interesting commander in that it unlocks a number of combos which do close out the game. Azorius generally relies on the slow, deliberate approach of amassing creatures, usually leaning into those evasive flyers, to crash in to win through combat damage in casual games, but will also sometimes lean on cards with win the game printed on them, like Laboratory Maniac or Approach of the Second Sun, to close things out. Azorius is control. This is the color identity that sets the rules of the game with stacks effects, and dictates how the stack resolves with counter magic and with silences. It enforces its will with great answers to permanence, overcoming one of Blue's weaknesses with White's excellent suite of answers, while having some of the best draw engines in the game right now. Outside of cEDH, a lot of decks lean into ETBs and blink effects to generate value turn after turn, and the designers at WotC are experimenting with technology that can increase the viability of some of the color identity's common limited environment staples, like flyers and tap down. Azorius tends to win when it can survive the early game, keeping opponents manageable and predictable, then outvaluing its opponents by either reducing the value of the cards they're drawing or grinding out additional advantage turn over turn. Azorius lacks the explosive starts and exponential growth that decks which touch a color in Jund have access to, relying on mana rocks to be effective. And while Azorius lacks many unconditional tutors, it can lean into its strengths in finding artifacts, enchantments, instants, and sorceries, as well as enough to chain together some pretty effective lines to get almost anything that it needs. White has had a glow up in recent years, and the suite of efficient Azorius draw is one area that makes this color combination a very effective foundation to build upon. What are you brewing with in Azorius? Are you leaning into those harder control elements of the color identity, or are you going a little bit more off the beaten path? I'd love to hear about it. You can find us on YouTube, where we are part of the Commander Cookout Media Group. Leave in the comments. I'd be really interested to see what you're up to. You can also find us on Twitter, where we are at GemstoneMineMTG, or you can send us an email, gemstonemindpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.